You think wearing that old jacket makes you special? Judge Harrison's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade, his eyes narrowing on the elderly man standing before him. The defendant, Walter Mackenzie, 73 years old, with hands that trembled slightly as they gripped the worn leather of his bomber jacket, said nothing. His silence seemed to irritate the judge even more, the younger man's jaw tightening as he leaned forward from his elevated bench, the wood creaking under his weight. The charge was simple enough: disturbing the peace at the local Veterans Day parade. Walter had allegedly caused a scene when parade organizers tried to remove him from the veterans section, claiming he had no proof of service. The incident had escalated when Walter refused to leave, standing his ground until police were called. Now he stood in Judge Harrison's courtroom, a small-town tribunal where the judge's word was law and his patience notoriously thin, especially for what he called stolen valor cases. The prosecutor, a young woman fresh from law school, shuffled her papers nervously. She'd already presented the case. Walter had no military ID, no discharge papers, nothing to prove his claimed service. The parade organizers had been within their rights to ask him to leave. When he refused, when he'd planted himself like a tree and wouldn't budge even when threatened with arrest, he'd broken the law. Simple, clean, except something in the old man's eyes made her uncomfortable, a depth there that spoke of things she couldn't quite grasp. "I asked you a question," Judge Harrison pressed, his voice rising slightly. The courtroom was nearly empty, just a few locals who had nothing better to do on a Tuesday morning, a court reporter whose fingers hesitated over her keys, and a man in the back row who'd entered quietly during the prosecutor's opening statement. This last observer sat perfectly still, his posture rigid in a way that suggested military training, his eyes never leaving Walter's back. Walter finally looked up, meeting the judge's gaze with eyes the color of winter sky. "No, Your Honor," he said quietly, his voice carrying a slight rasp. "The jacket doesn't make anyone special." His fingers brushed the faded leather, tracing invisible patterns across patches that had long since lost their color. Beneath the fluorescent lights of the courtroom, the jacket looked shabby, worn thin at the elbows, the zipper replaced at least twice judging by the mismatched metal. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at his lips. At 38, he considered himself a guardian against those who would steal the honor of real veterans. His own father had served in Vietnam, had come home broken in ways that never fully healed. The thought of someone pretending to that kind of service, wearing it like a costume, made his blood boil. Then why wear it? Why stand in a section reserved for real heroes? Why refuse to leave when asked by people who actually served? The man in the back row shifted slightly, his hand moving to his phone. His fingers moved swiftly across the screen, typing a message that would soon reach offices most people in this small town couldn't imagine existing. But his eyes remained on the scene unfolding before him, watching as Walter's shoulders straightened imperceptibly, the only sign of the steel that still existed beneath the weathered exterior. "I've been standing in that spot for 15 years, Walter said, his voice steady now, though still soft. "Same spot. Every Veterans Day, every Memorial Day, sometimes Christmas when the snow isn't too deep." He paused, his eyes distant, seeing something beyond the courtroom walls. "There's a reason for that particular spot." "Let me guess," Judge Harrison interrupted, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You have some elaborate story about your service. Some reason you can't produce any documentation. Classified missions, perhaps. Records sealed for national security." He'd heard it all before, every excuse, every fabrication. They usually broke down under pressure, admitted their lies when faced with real consequences. "Do you know what we do to people who steal valor in my courtroom?" The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Something felt wrong about this, though she couldn't put her finger on what. The old man wasn't acting like the other cases she'd seen. No bravado, no elaborate stories, just quiet dignity and that unsettling stillness, like a deep lake that hadn't been disturbed in decades. She glanced at the police report again. The arresting officer had noted that Walter had been completely cooperative once arrested, had come quietly, hadn't resisted at all. He'd only refused to move from that spot until they physically escorted him away. "Your Honor," Walter began, but Harrison cut him off with a sharp gesture. "No, I've heard enough. You're a coward, Mr. Mackenzie, a coward and a thief, stealing honor that belongs to better men than you." The judge's face had turned red, his personal investment in this case clear to everyone present. "You stand there in a jacket you probably bought at a surplus store, claiming a service you never performed, taking a place that belongs to real heroes. Do you know what my father went through in Vietnam? Do you know what real veterans sacrificed?" The court reporter had stopped typing, her hands frozen above the keys. The tension in the room had shifted, become something palpable, electric. The man in the back row stood slowly, his movement drawing several eyes, but he simply walked to the door and stepped outside, his phone already at his ear. Through the door's window, those who noticed could see him speaking urgently, his free hand gesturing as if explaining something complex. Walter's hand moved to his chest, fingers finding something beneath his shirt. A chain, thin and well-worn, emerged as he pulled it over his head. Dog tags clinked softly as they came to rest in his palm, the metal worn smooth in places from decades of contact with skin. But it wasn't the tags that made the prosecutor gasp softly. It was what hung with them, a piece of metal so distinctive that even she, with her limited military knowledge, recognized it. "Your father served with the 25th Infantry Division," Walter said, his voice carrying something new now, a weight that seemed to fill the room. "Cu Chi District, 1968 to 1969. Specialist Harrison. Good soldier. I remember him." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Harrison's mouth opened, then closed, no sound emerging. He was 19, scared, they all were, but he did his duty. "How could you possibly—" Harrison began, but Walter continued as if he hadn't spoken. "Operation Yellowstone, February 1969. Your father's unit was pinned down near the Cambodian border. 3 days. No resupply, no evacuation for the wounded. Walter's eyes had taken on that 1,000-yard stare that combat veterans knew too well, seeing things that existed only in memory now but were no less real for it. I know because I was flying the dust off that finally got through, took 37 rounds in the fuselage, lost my door gunner, kid from Nebraska, 20 years old, but we got your father and 6 others out." The prosecutor stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Your Honor, I think—" But her words were drowned out by the sudden sound of vehicles outside, multiple engines, doors slamming. Through the courtroom windows, black SUVs were visible, government plates catching the morning sun. The man who'd been in the back row was standing by the lead vehicle, pointing toward the courthouse entrance. Judge Harrison's face had gone pale, his hands gripping the edge of his bench. "That's impossible. The pilot who saved my father was... he was..." His voice trailed off as Walter lifted the piece of metal that hung with his tags, holding it so the light caught its surface. A silver star, the ribbon faded, but the metal itself still gleaming. "Call sign Dustoff 7-3, Walter said quietly, though that wasn't what they usually called me. He paused, his eyes meeting Harrison's. "Your father might have mentioned the name they used. The crews started it as a joke, but it stuck." Harrison's face went even paler, if that was possible. His father had told the story countless times about the crazy pilot who'd flown through hell itself to reach them, who'd landed a shot-up bird in a hot LZ with incoming mortar fire, who'd refused to leave until every wounded man was aboard, even as the helicopter was literally falling apart around him. They'd called him the Angel of Death, not because he brought death, but because he stole soldiers from death's grasp, pulled them back from the edge again and again until the day his luck ran out. Except, apparently, his luck hadn't run out after all. The courtroom doors burst open. 3 men in military dress uniforms entered, their ranks and ribbons declaring them as people who didn't normally appear in small-town courtrooms. The lead, a lieutenant general whose chest carried enough decorations to stock a small museum, walked directly to Walter. The entire courtroom watched in stunned silence as the general stopped, came to attention, and delivered a salute so crisp it could have cut paper. "Colonel Mackenzie," the general said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of command. "I apologize for the delay. When we received word of your situation, the secretary himself insisted we respond immediately." Walter returned the salute slowly, his arm shaking slightly with age, but the gesture itself precise. "No need for the fuss, Tom. I was handling it." Despite the situation, a small smile crossed his weathered features. "How's Margaret? Still putting up with you?" The general, Tom, allowed himself a brief smile. 40 years next month, sir. She still tells the story about the time you landed in our backyard because the fog was too thick to find the base." He turned then, his expression hardening as he faced Judge Harrison. "Your Honor, I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding here." Harrison couldn't speak. His mouth moved, but no words emerged. The prosecutor had sat back down, her hands folded in her lap, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. The court reporter had given up any pretense of transcription, simply staring. "Colonel Walter Mackenzie," the general continued, his voice now formal, carrying to every corner of the courtroom, "is one of the most decorated helicopter pilots in United States military history. 3 Silver Stars, 4 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 2 Purple Hearts, and—" He paused, his next words carrying special weight. "The Medal of Honor for actions on March 15, 1971, when he flew 17 consecutive missions into a surrounded Special Forces camp, evacuating 93 wounded despite his aircraft being so damaged that by all laws of physics, it shouldn't have been able to fly." The silence in the courtroom was complete, broken only by the soft wheeze of the ancient air conditioning system. Walter stood quietly, his eyes focused on something distant, perhaps seeing those missions again, feeling the stick shake in his hands as the bird took hit after hit, hearing the cries of wounded men who needed him to keep flying just a little longer. "The reason," the general continued, now addressing the room at large, "that Colonel Mackenzie has no readily available military ID or standard discharge papers is that his service record was classified at the highest levels for 35 years. Some of the missions he flew are still classified. The men he saved aren't. There are 347 documented saves credited to Dustoff 7-3. That's 347 men who came home because Walter Mackenzie refused to leave them behind." Judge Harrison finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "My father, he said the pilot who saved him was killed in 72, shot down over Laos." Walter's expression softened slightly. "I was shot down, spent 8 months as a guest of the North Vietnamese, another 4 in a military hospital afterward. By the time I could have contacted anyone, your father had rotated home. Seemed easier to let the dead stay dead." He shrugged, a gesture that carried decades of weight. "Been living quiet since then. Small disability check, smaller apartment, that spot at the parade." He paused, his voice catching slightly. "That's where Tommy Kowalski's mother stands. My door gunner from that day. I promised her I'd stand with her every year, make sure she wasn't alone." The prosecutor stood again, her voice shaking. Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges immediately. But Harrison wasn't looking at her. He had stood from his bench, something judges rarely did during proceedings, and was walking down to the courtroom floor. His hand shook as he approached Walter, and when he spoke, his voice broke completely. You saved my father's life. He talked about you until the day he died, said you were the bravest man he'd ever known. Walter looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, and perhaps saw something of the young specialist he'd pulled from that jungle clearing decades ago. Your father was a good man? He wrote to me once after I got back to the world. Said he'd named his son after his grandfather, a judge. Said he hoped you'd grow up to be fair and just. A pause. Seems he got his wish. Harrison's face crumpled then, the weight of his earlier words crushing down on him. I called you a coward. I said, God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. But Walter stepped forward, placing a weathered hand on the younger man's shoulder. You were protecting something sacred, the honor of real veterans, your father's memory. He squeezed gently. Nothing cowardly about that. Just maybe next time ask a few more questions before passing judgment. The general cleared his throat. Colonel, we've arranged for your full records to be updated in the system. You'll have new ID within the week. Additionally, the Secretary has authorized back payment for several commendations that were classified at the time. And, he smiled slightly, there's the matter of the Presidential Unit citation ceremony next month. The surviving members of the 229th have been asking when you'd finally show up to receive it. Walter shook his head. Don't need ceremonies, Tom. Just need that spot at the parade. You'll have it, Harrison said quickly, his voice thick with emotion. Any spot you want, for as long as you want it, and if anyone ever questions your right to be there. He straightened, something of his judicial authority returning. They'll answer to me personally. The courtroom had begun to fill as word spread through the small town like wildfire. People peered through the windows, crowded at the doors. Phones were out, recording, sharing. The story would be viral within hours. The judge who'd called a Medal of Honor recipient a coward, only to discover the man had saved his own father's life. But Walter wasn't paying attention to any of that. He was looking at his watch, then toward the door. If we're done here, I need to go. Mrs. Kowalski will be wondering where I am. Tuesday is when I help her with grocery shopping. He started toward the door, then paused, looking back at Harrison. Your father, after we got him on the bird, he kept saying something, over and over. Tell my son I love him. Tell him I'm coming home. Figured you should know. He was thinking of you. Harrison couldn't respond, couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. He watched as Walter walked toward the door, the general and his entourage following. At the threshold, Walter stopped once more, turning back to face the courtroom. One more thing, he said, his voice carrying to everyone present. That young prosecutor there, she did her job, did it well. Don't hold this against her. Sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing, but that doesn't mean we don't need people willing to stand up for both. The prosecutor nodded, tears streaming down her face. The court reporter had given up all pretense of professionalism and was openly crying. Even the bailiff, a crusty old veteran himself, was wiping his eyes. As Walter left the courtroom, the crowd parted before him. Some saluted, those who'd served recognizing something in his bearing that transcended age and civilian clothes. Others simply stood in respectful silence. One young man wearing an army t-shirt called out, "Thank you for your service, sir." Walter paused, looked at the young soldier, and nodded. Still serving, son, just in different ways. 3 weeks later, Judge Harrison stood in the same spot where Walter Mackenzie had been arrested. The parade was in full swing, bands playing, crowds cheering, But Harrison only had eyes for the small section reserved for veterans, where an elderly man in a worn bomber jacket stood next to a tiny woman who clutched his arm like a lifeline. Mrs. Kowalski, he'd learned, had been standing in that spot for 30 years, ever since her son hadn't come home. And for 15 of those years, Walter had stood with her, ensuring she never stood alone. Harrison approached slowly, respectfully. Walter saw him coming and nodded slightly. No words were needed. Harrison took his place on Walter's other side, standing at attention as the colors passed. 3 generations of service united in a moment of understanding. Later, as the parade ended and the crowds dispersed, Walter turned to Harrison. "Your father would be proud of you," he said simply. "You've got his sense of justice. Just needed to learn that sometimes justice wears old clothes and can't prove who it is." Harrison nodded, his throat tight. "Will you tell me about him?" "About that day. My father never could. It was too much for him." Walter considered for a moment, then nodded. "Come by tomorrow, bring coffee, the good stuff, not that courthouse swill. I'll tell you about your father, about all of them." He paused, his eyes distant again. Someone should remember. Someone should know. As they parted ways, Harrison watched the old pilot walk slowly down the street, Mrs. Kowalski still on his arm, her soft voice carrying on the wind as she told him about her week, about her grandchildren, about everything except the son who would never come home. And Walter listened, as he had for 15 years, being the witness her grief required, the promise kept to a young door gunner who died saving others. The story made national news, of course. Cable news shows dissected it from every angle. Social media exploded with opinions and hot takes. But in a small town, in a small courtroom, a judge had learned something about assumptions, about respect, and about the quiet heroes who walk among us, wearing their history in faded leather and worn dog tags, standing guard over promises made to the dead, asking for nothing more than the right to remember. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the veterans in your life who served with honor and came home to live with quiet dignity, please share it. Like and subscribe to hear more stories of unsung heroes, of sacrifices remembered, and of the bonds that tie us across generations. Because somewhere, in every small town, there's a Walter Mackenzie standing watch, keeping faith, ensuring that those who gave everything are never, ever forgotten.